Now we're getting back into our topic of discussion to look steadily at what we're having today on the matters to do with debt transparency in Uganda. Now, on the other issue of borrowing in the country, David is still here with me, by the way. So, David, do we really need to borrow as a country?
I think we've reached a point where we need to cut on our debt appetite.
Okay.
And when it comes to, the word debt appetite is huge, okay, but it mainly details, always borrowing for even areas you shouldn't be borrowing for. Okay. For example, Uganda, currently our cost of public administration is very high. And recently in the financial year 2022-23, we even made it much higher by increasing the salaries of scientists.
But then, starting this financial year.
Yeah, starting this financial year. And the risk is that most of these expenditures, or most of our public expenditure, goes on wage. So just a little bit of our public expenditure is allocated to development. So that's a risk. So when you borrow mainly to sustain your wage and recurrent expenditure, that means you're running a huge risk. And most of the countries, what they did was that when times got hard, they cut on their cost of public expenditure. They cut on the salaries, they cut on the public servants. I know Uganda, we have that huge duplication in, for example, the agencies. And we've been having a long discussion on how can we start now rationalizing to ensure that if we have 3 agencies of government doing the same job, okay, we can merge them and of course have a few staff that will do almost the same amount of work that these 4 were doing. But then when we also look at the cars, the what, we are living large in times when we are very poor and indebted. So we think in some of the projects we are borrowing for, we really don't need to borrow. And for us, our discussion is that we would want to borrow for only those areas that have a commercial benefit to the country and that we are then able to get a quick return on investment that can then boost our fiscal landscape as a country.
Okay, and where are we mainly borrowing these funds from? Because the question would be, we are talking about these funds and we're talking about the public debt, but where does the money come from?
Currently, Uganda has a huge, can we call it a huge collection of either generous lenders but initially when we went into the initial discussions of debt back in the 90s, we used to mainly borrow from multilaterals. Those used to include mainly the International Monetary Funds, the World Banks, and the African Development Banks entirely. I know because they are borrowing terms. Sometimes they can be stringent, but then, we saw some bit of relief when it comes to programs such as the HIPIC, that was the highly indebted poor countries, that at some point our debts were entirely forgiven. And that's because, for multilaterals, sometimes they tend to, look at the global goals of development, and sometimes they contribute to those. And if they feel that a country is transitioning from Millennium Development Goals to Sustainable Development Goals and you're still hugely indebted, and they believe that debt will have an impact on your transition and your subsequent development, they come up with some of these relief programs. But currently we've seen now a huge shift into now the bilaterals. And of course that's when now we saw more lenders from China Exim banks, we saw more lenders from India Exim banks, and all these other lenders.
Okay.
And because for them, they are mainly concessional. Their debts have relatively low interest rates, and also terms are not so stringent. But I think the disservice we've seen with some of the bilaterals is that some of their debts are collateralized. So that's where I see discussions of Entebbe Airport, You see discussions of toll fees on certain road projects, because then they need to recoup, but they need security. So if you run a debt with bilaterals, you know, the problem is they don't look so much on the development obligations.
Okay.
For them, theirs is strictly business. You get it? So that's a huge risk, and that's why we saw some of our poor countries, and sometimes we would call them more semi-autocratic countries, preferring to go for bilaterals, because multilaterals tend to come with certain obligations. For example, obligations on democracy, obligations on transparency, obligations on human rights that are conditioned to these debts. And for them, their interest is they would want to see the monies they give to a country contributing to the development of a country, and not just specific or certain aspects of a country.
Okay, and recommendations on how best we can utilize these debts, how we can acquire them and use them effectively, because that is a big concern.
Yeah, going into recommendations,
Okay.
I think the first one is that we would want to see more transparency and accountability when it comes to these debts. We want to see, you know, for example, the reports that Minister of Finance, you know, publishes, would want to see more, you know, more detailed when it comes to these reports, but also publishing them. We want them to be more open when it comes to, you know, those reports being published in the media.
Okay.
Then also when it comes to issues of transparency, we also want to see more participation of all partners at all the stages of the debt process. We wouldn't want to see just Minister of Finance negotiating a debt with a certain, you know, entity, and then after approval, then they tell us that, you know, Uganda has acquired this debt, is going to do ABCD, without involving all the partners. Then also would want to see, still on debt transparency, would want to see this information on debt published, you know, broadly and disseminated broadly. And one of the things we are thinking that the country needs to put in place is a debt register, or at least we have a section on debt on the Minister of Finance website. So that then if, like, I have a component on budget on the website currently, that I'll go on budget.go.ug and access all budget information. The same should apply to debt, so that then the citizens and all these other stakeholders can critically look into the debt matters and have, you know, an informed discussion on debt. And also we think there should be more information on collateralized debt in especially the annual reports on debt, so that we are able to know what is it that we've mortgaged, you know, what are those assets, or what is it that we've basically, we want to assess the risk we have every year in terms of debt. Because we wouldn't want to see shocking news like it happened some time ago with the airport saga. At least we want to see more openness on some of these, you know, collateral obligations when it comes to debt. And then also want to have this discussion being sent to the citizens. Every Ugandan, I think it's time to know how much, you know, what's our current debt stock. If last year it was 73 trillion, how is it standing currently? And what are those unexpected moves that government, you know, thinks it should put in place to ensure that, you know, we reduce on our debt burden. But then also would want to see more efficiency when it comes to management of debt. And also we want to see the country looking at all the other possible alternatives to borrowing.
Because I'd want to look at those alternatives. What are those?
The alternatives, one of them, the quick one, is of course cutting your expenditure. But then the other alternative is, you know, commercializing, so that if I'm borrowing, at least there has to be a commercial aspect of it. Then the other one is the role of the parastatals. because we had decided to privatize. But I think now it's time we have a discussion on how can we now have, a government hand in most of these parastatals.
Okay.
In economical senses, of course. If you are running a Uganda Airlines, how can we make it more efficient and effective? Because in government terms, sometimes they don't mind about efficiency. They mind about effectiveness. But now, we want to see more efficiency, doing a lot, but at a lesser cost. When it comes to things of electricity, because these were, key income earners, when it comes to issues of transport, when it comes to, telecommunications, how much is government ready now to start doing business so that it can generate alternative income, as opposed to, looking at the diminishing or shrinking revenue, domestic revenues from tax. So discussions on non-tax revenue should also be amplified, and also support some of these revenue collection agencies to ensure that they can collect enough and avoid some of those loopholes. And then there's some other discussion, especially on tax and revenue. The discussion on tax expenditures. We launched a report the other week on Uganda's tax expenditure, and you'll be shocked that about the current report, about 5 trillion Ugandan shillings is lost in tax expenditures. Tax expenditures mainly entail, tax exemptions, tax holidays, tax subsidies, and, we are giving expenditures to investors that would even invest without being given holidays and subsidies. And sometimes government has to commit and at a certain point pay tax on behalf of the investors. And for us, we think it is wrong, because what drives investment in Uganda is, access to access to factors of production. So we are living in a situation where we are giving so much to investors who would even have invested without some of these incentives. And 5.5 trillion, that's almost the same amount we are paying for debt interest in the current financial year 2020 to 23, because it's about the same 5.5 trillion, but minus the debt servicing monies, which is about 2.4 trillion shillings. So I think if we can cut on some of these expenditures in tax, we can, we can cover up for that deficit. And then also we can't, distance ourselves from the discussion of corruption, the discussions on illicit financial flows, because those economic hemorrhages, they really affect, our ability to finance our economy. We've seen a lot of cross-border illicit trade. How can we curb that? When you look at, sometime we had discussions on gold, that Uganda was among, now the leading countries in exporting gold, but one, we don't know where the gold comes from, and even the destinations are not so known. But these are extractives and natural resources that can amplify our revenue mobilization efforts. So if we can curb on this, all that money will come back to the economy, and it will be able to cut on our deficits.
Okay. Now, lastly, I would like you to comment on the issue of the extended credit facility, which was
the
IMF program that was geared towards economic recovery in Uganda.
I think a little bit of the extended credit facility is that it was derived from the special drawing rights. Every country has a provision under SDR that you're given a certain amount of money. It's more like, in a layman, I would call it points that are then computed into monetary terms. And you're given that amount, but it's targeted towards financing certain aspects. So the extended credit facility that we got in 2021, it was to a tune of about $1 billion. I think I said that before, but it was in a phased manner. But this money was mainly targeted towards boosting economic recovery. So they wanted to see how ordinary Ugandans can have more monies in their pockets. If someone, went out of business during COVID, if maybe you are operating a certain agency, and you can't progress. There were some of those struggling economic sectors, so it was mainly geared towards helping government support the SMEs to recover from the effects of especially the economic effects of COVID-19 pandemic. And I think the first disbursement was about $248 million, and most of the disbursements have been, provided already. But the obligation there under was that governments had to also, fulfill their obligations to fully account for the expenditures of these monies. And like I said, that's why we would want to get more borrowing from, the multilaterals more than the bilaterals, because at least their loans are, they have some terms that put government on pressure to, to fulfill accountability obligations, as opposed to bilaterals that are mainly driven by forces of demand and supply.
All right. Now, lastly, your final remarks as we're winding up with our discussion.
My final remarks, I think it would basically be a call to government, one, to amplify, this discussion on debt transparency. Would want to see more openness when it comes to aspects of debt, but would also want to start borrowing monies that are in the interest of, one, the national development plan, but also in the interest of, fostering economic development. We want to see loans that are geared towards, supporting either startups or supporting the industry when it comes to, for example, manufacturing, value addition, so that in the end, we can boost trade as opposed to having infrastructures but, being utilized by poor Ugandans. So we want to see debt that is sustainable, but also want to at least government should bring, all stakeholders on board in terms of debt negotiation. We welcome moves such as, we are now moving towards a more coordinated public investment management, and that's through the public investment management strategy that was being revised. I know through this, government intends to see that before these loans are approved, at least all these feasibility studies, approvals, and everything is undertaken, and then we can commit to borrow. But we'd want to see a more participatory approach, a more multi-stakeholder approach towards negotiating. Previously, civil societies haven't been part of the discussion, and even the private sector. But we think it's now time that government opens up the discussion to even civil society, because mainly the civil society represent, the voices of the majority. And if we can have that, we believe we shall have a more engaging and, fruitful discussion on public debt and development in Uganda.
Okay. And all right, now that brings us to the end of our topic of discussion, which was focusing on debt transparency and accountability. And our guest today was David Chizito from Transparency International Uganda. That is it for our topic of discussion.
Wow.
All right, then now we're heading into our SMB Insight, and at this time round, we take a look at the Credit Reference Bureau, which is in Uganda. And the Credit Reference Bureau is a company licensed by Central Bank of Uganda to collect, store, and collect credit information on individuals and companies from different sources, as well as providing the information in form of a credit report upon the request of a lender. Now, the CRB contributes significantly to reduction in the costs of screening loan applications by enabling the lender to sort out prospective borrowers who have defaulted with other lenders. As CRB therefore improves lenders' ability to predict default. It was a launch for people, especially bankers, to understand how it works and embrace it. Let's have more from the SMB Insight.
As a banker, especially one in credit risk management, I would say that my takeaway would be the advantage there is in having a wide spectrum of data as opposed to what we've had on the credit bureau before. It has been said here that we have additional service providers other than the we call them the conventional financial institutions that have been previously loaded onto the credit bureaus. So if new good credit bureaus coming in to provide additional data from other service providers and from the tier 4s, then I see that as a benefit that we cannot even speak of. It's never before been done, and I'm interested to see what that does for our credit risk, for lending, for the industry as a whole.
Our solution offers a win-win situation or a win-win solution to the banks and the borrowers. So for the bank, of course, they get a chance to look at someone's credit history, 360-degree someone's credit history. So as a bureau, we are able to provide the bank with that kind of information. So if they want to lend an individual, they look at their credit score, their credit application or credit profiles, and their repayment, and a couple of other details that we incorporate in the credit report. Now, depending on how that data looks like on a report, it gives a bank some sort of an insight on, for things like interest rate, because the credit report showcases the credit score, which summarizes someone's credit risk or the level of risk. So if someone has a very low credit score, it means that person is very risky, and the bank can use that to cut on the limit or suspend it. Now, if a borrower has a very good credit score, then the bank can increase the limit because that person is actually bankable and he takes his loan obligations very well. So the bank can use that to increase the limit, and also to onboard the customer. Now, in that scenario, the customer can actually even bargain the interest rate, and the cost of borrowing or the cost of financing also reduces because this is a very good customer. He has a very positive score. Now, for a borrower that want to borrow money from the bank, for us, we give them a platform where they can double check their credit report, the status of their credit report and the credit score before they can even go to the bank to apply for the loan. So that reduces, the time around, the back and forth and all those paperwork that could be required.
It is extremely important to have as much information as you can possibly have on any borrower, on anybody that you are trying to onboard, new, existing. As much information as you can possibly have is extremely important in making credit decisions for any financial institution, be it a tier 1 or a tier 4 institution.
We look at the different variables. So initially we are looking about 120 different variables, but these have been merged to about 9, and this depends on the weight of the variables. For example, we look at closed or unsecured loans in the last 12 months, outstanding balance. So these are some of the variables we look at, but there are 9 of them, and of course we look at the predictive strength of each of the variables. So it ranges from 0.02 to about 0.8. So any variable with 0.02 is considered less important, so that one we drop it out, and we consider variables that have a weight value of 0.2 to about 8. For example, multiple borrowing or multiple accounts with different banks, that has the most predictive weight, but also it's also considered as one of the most high risk kind of variable that we look at.
Okay, this was a launch for people, especially bankers, to understand how it works and embrace it. That is according to this is the Credit Reference Bureau. And the CRB, that is the Credit Reference Bureau, contributes significantly to reduction in the cost of screening loan applications by enabling the lender to sort out prospective borrowers who have defaulted with other lenders. Now, a CRB therefore improves lenders' ability to predict a default before it does happen. And that is it for our SBM Insight this morning. After the break, we head on ground with Barry J. Andrew. Good morning.